Deep in the mountains of Ethiopia, locked away for over 1,500 years, there's a book the Catholic Church never wanted you to lay eyes on. An ancient gospel with passages so explosive about the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Its very existence shatters everything you thought you knew about early Christianity. We're not talking some flimsy conspiracy theory or Sunday school fiction here, folks. We're talking sacred texts, deliberately cut from the Bible you read today. Documents that spill a truth so potent, the powers that be in the church preferred they stay buried in those remote African monasteries. The Ethiopian Bible, called the Ge'ez, packs 81 books, compared to the 66 in your Protestant version, or the 73 in the Catholic one. But this ain't just a numbers game, it's about what's inside. These extra texts, they paint Mary Magdalene not as some repentant prostitute, but as Jesus' closest spiritual partner, his intellectual equal, the one he trusted with secret teachings he didn't even share with Peter or John. Just imagine that for a second. The woman Western tradition has pushed to the sidelines for 2 millennia, suddenly showing up in these pages as the real torchbearer of Christ's message. The eggheads who've actually gotten their hands on these primary sources describe scenes where Jesus calls Mary Magdalene, the one who knows all, entrusting her with mysteries he kept hidden from his other followers. In one of these forbidden texts, Jesus flat out declares that Mary Magdalene grasps the kingdom's secrets better than any man, and that through her, the true nature of salvation will be revealed. This isn't some New Age interpretation or theological guesswork, buddy. These are direct fragments from manuscripts that have survived in those Ethiopian monastic libraries, preserved under conditions you wouldn't believe. So why did these texts stick around in Ethiopia while they vanished from the rest of the Christian world? The answer drags us into one of the Church's darkest chapters. See, in the early centuries of Christianity, there was a doctrinal Wild West, a diversity we can barely wrap our heads around today. You had Christian communities who revered Mary Magdalene as a top-tier apostolic figure, who believed in spiritual equality between men and women, and where women held real leadership roles in religious rituals. But once Christianity got its corporate makeover under the Roman Empire, that diversity became a ticking time bomb for centralized power. The Ethiopian texts hold the smoking gun for these alternative Christianities, proving that the version of the faith we got today wasn't the only one, or necessarily even the most authentic. In these manuscripts, Mary Magdalene is out there working miracles, preaching to crowds, getting direct divine downloads. Even more jaw-dropping, some passages hint that Jesus handpicked her to carry on his mission after he was gone, giving her an authority the canonical Gospels conveniently forgot to mention. Recent investigations have blown the lid off the whole Mary Magdalene as prostitute thing. It's got zero basis in the oldest texts. That characterization, a later fabrication, cooked up, no doubt, to trash her influence and justify booting women out of church leadership. The Ethiopian manuscripts, they show us a totally different Mary Magdalene, an educated woman, spiritually light years ahead, and deeply tuned into Jesus' most esoteric teachings. One of the most mind-bending aspects of these texts is how they describe the bond between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. We're not talking some modern-day romance here, but a spiritual union so profound it blows past conventional categories. The manuscripts call them two souls sharing a light, perfect partners in the mission to expand human consciousness. This perspective throws a wrench in the works for those who see Jesus as eternally celibate, and those who picture him in a purely human relationship. These Ethiopian texts also drop teachings from Jesus that never made it into the canonical Gospels, specific instructions on spiritual practices, secret meditations, and methods to hit elevated states of consciousness. A lot of these teachings were passed down exclusively to Mary Magdalene, who, according to these manuscripts, safeguarded them for future generations. It's like we just unearthed a treasure trove of primitive Christian wisdom that's been sealed away for millennia. The preservation of these texts in Ethiopia wasn't some fluke either. Back when the Byzantine and Roman authorities started purging writings they labeled heretical, the Christian communities in East Africa managed to keep their traditions untouched. The Ethiopian mountains became a sanctuary where not just these texts survived, but also spiritual practices that had vanished from the rest of the Christian world. Those Ethiopian monks developed some seriously sophisticated copying and preservation techniques, using local materials and methods that stood the test of centuries. If you've stuck with me this far, it means your gut's telling you you're ready for truths that have been buried for too long. But this This is just the opening chapter of a journey that'll blow your mind. Not just about Christianity, but about the very nature of spirituality. Hit that subscribe button right now, because in the next videos, we're going to dig even deeper into these forbidden mysteries, cracking open specific texts that reveal aspects of Jesus' teachings the official story never wanted you to know. To really grasp what these discoveries mean, we got to look at the historical backdrop where these alternative texts first popped up. See, for the first 3 centuries of Christianity, before Emperor Constantine made it legal and then the Roman Empire's pet religion, there was an insane diversity of interpretations about who Jesus was, what his message meant, and how his followers' communities should be run. This diversity wasn't seen as a problem by those early Christian communities. In fact, many spiritual leaders back then thought this rich tapestry of perspectives strengthened Jesus' message, not weakened it. Gnostic Christians, for instance, were all about direct divine knowledge, while other groups focused on community and service. Some saw Jesus mainly as a teacher, others as a mystical savior, and some even believed he was a divine manifestation who'd completely transcended humanity. The Ethiopian manuscripts, they hint that Mary Magdalene was considered a central figure by many of these early communities, not some sidekick. Archaeological digs have unearthed evidence that in the early centuries of Christianity, there were churches where women held leadership roles equal to men, and where texts featuring female perspectives on Jesus' teachings were regularly read during services. Papyrus fragments dug up in Egypt, combined with these Ethiopian manuscripts, paint a radically different picture than what later church historians fed us. In these primitive communities, the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene was seen as a perfect blueprint for how the masculine and feminine could team up to expand spiritual consciousness. The Ethiopian texts describe teaching sessions where Jesus passed specific knowledge to Mary Magdalene, who then took on the job of instructing other disciples. This teaching dynamic wasn't unusual in the spiritual traditions of that era. Initiatic masters often handpicked specific students for advanced teachings, and those students became authorized transmitters of that wisdom. What's truly extraordinary is that a woman held such a prominent role in a culture that generally kept women locked out of formal religious affairs. The manuscripts also spill the beans that the teachings passed to Mary Magdalene included specific techniques for contemplative prayer, methods for interpreting dreams and visions, and practices to hit altered states of consciousness that allowed direct communication with the divine. These practices, according to the texts, were considered too potent to be taught just to anyone, which is why they were entrusted only to carefully vetted disciples. The Ethiopian tradition preserves detailed descriptions of some of these methods, including specific body postures, breathing patterns, and visualizations that supposedly opened up deeper levels of spiritual understanding. Come the 4th century, when Christianity started getting its institutional act together under Roman imperial sponsorship, these diverse traditions began to be seen as a real headache. The church leaders who rose to power back then were more interested in cranking out doctrinal uniformity than preserving the rich tapestry of perspectives that had defined early Christianity. This standardization wasn't just theological, folks. It was deeply political. Christianity was becoming the official religion of the most powerful empire the known world had ever seen. And with that transformation came the need for clear hierarchies, uniform doctrines, and standardized practices. The church councils of the 4th and 5th centuries didn't just chew over abstract theological questions. They also decided which texts got stamped authentic and which got tossed into the heretical or apocryphal bin. The criteria they used for these decisions weren't always purely spiritual, believe me. Political considerations, the need to maintain the existing social order, and the plain old desire to consolidate church power all played significant roles in figuring out which aspects of primitive Christianity would survive and which would get silenced. In this climate, texts that portrayed Mary Magdalene as a figure of spiritual authority, equal to or even superior to the male apostles, were a direct threat to the patriarchal structures the institutional church was borrowing from the Roman world. The suppression of these texts wasn't some accident, it was a systematic hit job. The manuscripts that survived in Ethiopia did so precisely because the Christian communities in that region maintained a certain independence from the decisions made in the councils dominated by the churches of the Mediterranean world. Specialists in primitive Christianity have identified clear patterns in the texts that got suppressed. Anything that gave prominent roles to women, that included teachings on direct spiritual practices instead of institutionalized rituals, or that hinted salvation could be found through inner knowledge rather than church mediation, those were far more likely to be branded heretical. The Ethiopian manuscripts, they're loaded with exactly these kinds of teachings, which explains both why they were wiped out elsewhere and why they survived in those African traditions. The implications of these discoveries go way beyond mere historical curiosity. If these Ethiopian texts contain authentic teachings from Jesus that were systematically cut from the official tradition, then millions of Christians have been robbed for centuries of fundamental aspects of the very message they claim to follow. The spiritual development techniques described in these manuscripts, the perspectives on women's roles in spiritual life, and the broader understanding of Christ's nature they lay out, these represent a lost legacy that could absolutely revolutionize how we understand Christianity today. But the story of these texts also uncovers something even deeper about the nature of power and information control. The systematic suppression of alternative perspectives wasn't unique to early Christianity. It's a pattern that's played out again and again throughout human history. The folks who control what info's available to the masses effectively sculpt the consensual reality for entire civilizations. These Ethiopian manuscripts offer us a peek into worlds of possibility that were deliberately slammed shut for most of humanity. The preservation of these texts in Ethiopia wasn't some historical accident. It was the result of unique geographical and political circumstances that allowed alternative Christian traditions to flourish far from the direct reach of Rome and Constantinople. While the big players in the Mediterranean world were setting up rigid orthodoxies and wiping out texts they deemed problematic, the Ethiopian Christian communities maintained libraries packed with a diversity of manuscripts that had been declared heretical everywhere else. Specialists who've studied the Ethiopian manuscript tradition have found that these communities didn't just hoard texts, they kept copying and passing them down generation after generation, keeping alive traditions of interpretation that had been snuffed out elsewhere. Ethiopia's relative isolation during certain periods of medieval history played a crucial role in this preservation. While Europe was wrestling with doctrinal controversies that led to the systematic book burning of anything labeled heretical, the Ethiopian monastic communities just kept on with their traditional practices of copying and studying manuscripts. Researchers have found evidence that these monks weren't just mechanically copying texts. They maintained oral traditions of interpretation that gave context and meaning to passages that might seem obscure or contradictory to modern readers. These oral traditions, passed from teacher to student for centuries, hold interpretive keys that light up aspects of the texts that would otherwise stay dark and incomprehensible. The manuscripts that have survived in Ethiopia include versions of Gospels that were declared apocryphal by the official councils, but that the Ethiopian communities considered authentic and authoritative. Among these are texts featuring extensive dialogues between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, discussions on spiritual practices that go way beyond traditional rituals, and teachings on the nature of divinity that differ significantly from the doctrinal formulations that became orthodox in the Mediterranean world. Specialists who've analyzed these texts have found internal consistencies and stylistic elements that strongly suggest their antiquity and possible authenticity, effectively challenging the traditional narratives about which texts should be considered canonical. One of the most significant bombshells from these manuscripts is the portrayal of Mary Magdalene, not just as a disciple, but as a teacher and authorized interpreter of Jesus' teachings. The Ethiopian texts contain passages where Jesus entrusts Mary with esoteric knowledge and specifically authorizes her to pass certain teachings on to other disciples. These descriptions stand in stark contrast to later representations of Mary Magdalene in Western tradition, where her role was systematically downplayed or twisted. Specialists in gender studies of early Christianity have pointed out that these Ethiopian texts preserve an older tradition where women held spiritual leadership roles that were later suppressed by patriarchal structures. The importance of these Ethiopian manuscripts stretches beyond just gender issues, hitting fundamental implications about the nature of spiritual authority and the passing down of sacred knowledge. The texts suggest that Jesus taught different levels of knowledge to different groups of disciples, with certain teachings kept under wraps for those deemed capable of understanding and responsibly transmitting them. This perspective of graduated esoteric teaching differs significantly from the universal revelation model that became dominant in institutionalized Christianity. If these Ethiopian traditions preserve authentic teachings, then important aspects of Jesus' original message might have been systematically locked out of mainstream traditions. Researchers who've dug into these texts have identified specific techniques for spiritual development that are described in detail in the Ethiopian manuscripts, but are either missing entirely or barely get a nod in the canonical texts. These include meditation practices, methods for inner contemplation, and specific exercises for developing spiritual capacities that push way beyond traditional prayer and ritual. Specialists have noticed similarities between these practices and mystical traditions that popped up independently in other cultures, suggesting that the Ethiopian texts might preserve elements of a universal tradition of spiritual development that got partially suppressed in Western Christianity. The relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, as it's laid out in these Ethiopian manuscripts, blasts past the conventional categories of teacher and disciple, or even spiritual partners. The texts suggest a union of purpose and understanding that operated on multiple levels. From practical collaboration in teaching to spiritual communion in dimensions, the texts describe as mysterious and ineffable. This presentation has led some specialists to suggest that the suppression of these texts wasn't just about controlling church power, but about squashing alternative models of spiritual relationship that challenged broader social norms about gender, authority, and the very nature of sacred union. Modern textual analysis techniques have allowed researchers to pore over these Ethiopian manuscripts with an unprecedented level of detail. Dating studies, vocabulary analysis, and comparisons with other ancient texts have all provided solid evidence that at least some of these manuscripts preserve traditions stretching back to the earliest centuries of Christianity. The linguistic and stylistic elements found in the Ethiopian texts show characteristics consistent with primitive Christian literature, but they also include unique variations and developments that suggest independent interpretive traditions that evolved in isolation from the mainstream currents of Christian thought. The preservation of these texts in Ethiopia also spotlights important aspects of cultural resistance and spiritual autonomy. The communities that clung to these manuscripts often did so while staring down external pressures to fall in line with imported orthodoxies. The fact that they persisted in preserving and transmitting texts that had been deliberately erased elsewhere speaks volumes. The fact that traditions once branded as heresy elsewhere simply underscores these communities' deep commitment to what they genuinely believed was authentic and valuable, regardless of external political or ecclesiastical pressures. This cultural resilience has essentially thrown a lifeline to modern generations, granting us access to perspectives on early Christianity that would have otherwise vanished into the dustbin of history. Beyond the core texts, these Ethiopian manuscripts also house centuries of commentaries and interpretations penned by local scholars. These aren't just footnotes. They're unique windows into how these communities grasped and put those ancient teachings into practice. What's striking is the sophisticated exegetical tradition they reveal, one that evolved entirely distinct from the interpretive methods taking root in Europe and the Middle East. Ethiopian interpretations often lean into the practical and experiential side of the teachings, offering a fascinating counterpoint, or sometimes a rich complement, to the more doctrinal slant prevalent in Western theology. The true depth of these Ethiopian interpretive traditions really comes into focus when we look at how local commentators tackled the relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Ethiopian scholars didn't shy away. They forged sophisticated conceptual frameworks to understand what they termed distinct levels of spiritual union. They recognized that conventional human relationship categories simply fell short of fully capturing what the texts presented. Some commentaries even propose this relationship was a model of spiritual complementarity, where gender differences weren't hurdles, but rather pathways to more complete forms of divine understanding and service. What's truly remarkable is how contemporary researchers have noted that these Ethiopian interpretive frameworks actually prefigured many concepts only recently articulated in modern studies of spirituality and transpersonal psychology. Descriptions in the Ethiopian texts of shared states of consciousness, intuitive communication, and unified purpose resonate uncannily with today's understanding of phenomena that push past the ordinary bounds of individual experience. This convergence, ancient wisdom tucked away in Ethiopia meeting modern insights, strongly suggests that the communities preserving these texts tapped into traditions of experiential knowledge that richly complemented their doctrinal understandings. Analyzing these Ethiopian manuscripts has also unearthed compelling evidence of cultural and intellectual cross-pollination, linking Ethiopian Christian communities to broader wisdom traditions spanning Africa and Asia. Certain elements within the texts point to influences from Coptic, Syriac, and perhaps even Buddhist and Hindu traditions, likely arriving in Ethiopia via ancient trade routes and monastic networks. This melting pot of influences forged unique interpretive traditions, seamlessly integrating multiple perspectives on the nature of spiritual connection and divine union. The preservation techniques employed by these Ethiopian communities are also worth a closer look. Over centuries, these manuscripts were meticulously copied and recopied, using methods that safeguarded not just the textual content, but also visual and symbolic elements, which were seen as integral to the message itself. Ethiopian scribes honed systems of notation and marginal commentary, effectively preserving multiple layers of interpretation. This allowed future generations to access both the original text and the accumulated insights gleaned by study communities who had engaged with these materials for ages. Recent deep dives into these preservation systems have unveiled that the Ethiopian manuscripts actually hold encoded information, surfacing only when the entire document is examined as one integrated system. Everything from the illumination patterns and color choices to the text layout, and even the writing materials themselves, seems to have been deliberately used to convey additional information, subtly complementing the explicit textual content. This level of sophistication implies that the communities who crafted and maintained these manuscripts possessed an advanced grasp of multimedia communication, integrating visual, textual, and symbolic elements in ways that maximized both the preservation and transmission of complex knowledge. The steadfast resistance of these Ethiopian traditions to forced assimilation also offers crucial insights into the very nature of spiritual authority and community autonomy. The communities who held onto these texts did so in the face of significant pressure to adopt interpretations sanctioned by outside powers. Their sheer persistence in upholding traditions they deemed authentic showcases a form of cultural defiance that prioritized spiritual integrity over political conformity. This cultural backbone has, in turn, preserved for modern generations access to vital alternatives to the dominant narratives surrounding early Christianity and the essence of religious authority. Moreover, the Ethiopian manuscripts offer glimpses into mystical and contemplative traditions that ran parallel to the more formal ecclesiastical structures. These traditions seem to have championed practices and understandings that put direct experience above doctrinal adherence, essentially carving out spaces for forms of spirituality that seamlessly blended intellectual, emotional, and experiential elements. The descriptions of contemplative practices found in some texts hint at sophisticated methods designed to cultivate states of consciousness that opened the door to direct apprehension of spiritual realities. If you find it as fascinating as I do how these Ethiopian traditions have safeguarded alternative perspectives on early Christianity, drop a comment below. Let us know what aspects you find most revealing about the sheer diversity of primitive Christian traditions that flourished outside the mainstream channels of doctrinal development. The influence of these Ethiopian traditions wasn't confined to the communities that directly upheld them. Historical studies have meticulously documented exchange networks that linked Ethiopian Christian communities with groups in Egypt, Sudan, and other African regions, all of whom also maintained distinctive Christian traditions. These vital connections facilitated the preservation and transmission of texts and traditions that had been stamped out elsewhere, essentially creating a reservoir of Christian diversity that weathered periods of enforced orthodoxy which had wiped out alternatives in other corners of the world. The methods these communities employed to integrate such diverse traditions also offer compelling blueprints for contemporary approaches to interfaith dialogue and spiritual integration. Ethiopian scholars crafted conceptual frameworks that not only allowed for, but actively embraced the coexistence of multiple perspectives, without demanding the erasure of differences. These approaches acknowledge that complex spiritual truths often necessitate a mosaic of viewpoints for full comprehension, and that such diversity and understanding can actually enrich, rather than threaten, spiritual integrity. The evidence embedded within the Ethiopian manuscripts has also fueled broader reevaluations of early Christian history and the very evolution of Christian orthodoxy. The texts strongly suggest that the spectrum of Christian beliefs and practices in the early centuries was far wider than conventional sources have typically led us to believe. This diversity wasn't just about doctrinal distinctions. It encompassed variations in spiritual practices, community structures, and fundamental understandings of religious authority. More recent investigations have unearthed that Ethiopian traditions didn't just preserve alternative texts concerning Jesus and Mary Magdalene. They also safeguarded entire methodologies for interpreting these texts that diverge significantly from the hermeneutical approaches established in Western Christianity. Ethiopian scholars developed interpretive systems that seamlessly integrated symbolic, literal, and mystical elements all at once, allowing the texts to operate on multiple levels of meaning without generating insurmountable contradictions. This multidimensional approach to textual interpretation hints that these Ethiopian communities held profound understandings of spiritual truth, recognizing the sacred text's capacity to communicate complex realities that transcend the limitations of purely literal or symbolic interpretations. Within the Ethiopian manuscripts, we also find detailed descriptions of ritual practices, which appear to have been specifically crafted to facilitate an experiential grasp of the relationships between figures like Jesus and Mary Magdalene, relationships that clearly moved beyond the conventional categories of master and disciple. These practices incorporated forms of contemplation that engaged both intellectual reflection and direct experience, thereby creating contexts where participants could tap into profound understandings of spiritual relationships that didn't solely rely on textual descriptions. The ritual elements described strongly suggest these communities nurtured living traditions that both complemented and enriched the insights gleaned from written texts. The preservation of these traditions in Ethiopia has also offered telling evidence of how early Christian communities navigated the inherent tensions between institutional authority and personal spiritual experience. The Ethiopian texts lay out community structures that recognized multiple forms of spiritual authority, including leadership roles founded on experiential wisdom and the proven ability to facilitate spiritual transformations in others. These structures, it seems, carved out spaces where figures like Mary Magdalene could be acknowledged as legitimate spiritual teachers without being forced to subordinate themselves to hierarchical structures that privileged particular forms of institutional authority. Comparative studies have conclusively shown that Ethiopian traditions maintained significant continuities with Gnostic and mystical traditions that were ultimately suppressed in other regions during the establishment of Christian orthodoxy. Yet these continuities aren't simply about preserving alternative heresies. Rather, they represent the sustained practice of approaches to Christian spirituality that integrated elements later artificially separated by specific doctrinal developments. The Ethiopian texts strongly suggest it was entirely possible to hold sophisticated understandings of figures like Jesus and Mary Magdalene that honored both their human dimensions and their spiritual significance, without creating problematic dichotomies between these aspects. The contemplative traditions preserved in the Ethiopian manuscripts also detail specific techniques for cultivating states of consciousness that open the door to direct insights into the nature of profound spiritual relationships. These techniques appear to have been engineered precisely to allow practitioners to access levels of understanding about figures like Jesus and Mary Magdalene that soared beyond the limitations of purely conceptual knowledge. The descriptions of these practices point to sophisticated methods that seamlessly wove together elements of contemplation, visualization, and embodied experience in ways that facilitated deep transformations in practitioners' understanding and experience. The evidence contained within the Ethiopian texts has further contributed to sweeping reevaluations concerning the role of women in early Christianity and how that role was subsequently curtailed or reinterpreted by specific institutional developments. The manuscripts preserve depictions of Mary Magdalene that underscore her function as a transmitter of complex spiritual teachings and her remarkable capacity to facilitate profound understandings in others. These portrayals strongly suggest her role in primitive Christian communities was far more central and multifaceted than conventional sources have led us to believe, and that later restrictions on female leadership represented significant departures from more inclusive early Christian practices. Scholars poring over these Ethiopian manuscripts have also pinpointed evidence of theological dialogue and debate traditions that operated on fundamentally different principles than those established in the more orthodox Christian centers. These traditions, it seems, valued the exploration of complex questions and the consideration of multiple perspectives as essential components of spiritual development, rather than emphasizing rigid adherence to specific doctrinal formulations. This approach to theological discourse fostered environments where sophisticated understandings of figures like Jesus and Mary Magdalene could be explored, free from the constraints imposed by the need for doctrinal conformity. Ethiopian traditions also championed approaches to the study of sacred texts that recognized the profound importance of personal experience and spiritual transformation as critical benchmarks for evaluating the validity and utility of particular interpretations. This perspective suggested that an authentic grasp of figures like Jesus and Mary Magdalene demanded not just intellectual analysis, but also the cultivation of capacities for direct experience, opening access to dimensions of meaning simply unavailable through purely academic methods. The texts delineate study processes that seamlessly integrated contemplative and experiential elements in ways that fostered transformative understandings. The preservation of these alternative traditions in Ethiopia has vividly demonstrated that forms of early Christianity existed, which held more holistic understandings of spirituality and profound spiritual relationships. These understandings acknowledged that figures like Jesus and Mary Magdalene operated on levels of reality that transcended the conventional categories used to describe ordinary human relationships. Yet these transcendent dimensions neither negated nor contradicted their human and relational aspects. The Ethiopian texts suggest integrative approaches that honored the full complexity of these figures without reducing them to simplistic categories. Contemporary studies of these manuscripts have revealed that Ethiopian traditions also preserved understandings regarding the nature of revelation and spiritual authority that significantly diverged from those established within institutional Christianity. These understandings recognized multiple channels for receiving spiritual wisdom and valued forms of authority rooted in the capacity to facilitate transformation and understanding in others, rather than relying exclusively on institutional positions or formal credentials. This approach to spiritual authority created contexts where figures like Mary Magdalene could be recognized as legitimate teachers, based on the depth of her insight and her effectiveness in guiding others toward transformative experiences. The implications of these discoveries for our understanding of early Christianity are nothing short of profound and transformative. The Ethiopian manuscripts lay bare that during Christianity's nascent centuries, multiple theological currents coexisted and evolved in ways dramatically different from what later solidified into official orthodoxy. These alternative currents weren't simply deviations or heresies. They represented legitimate developments of the core message transmitted by the earliest Christian communities. A careful study of these texts has unequivocally shown that the understandings of Jesus and Mary Magdalene preserved in Ethiopian traditions reflected authentic historical memories, meticulously kept alive by communities with direct access to original teachings. Researchers digging into these manuscripts have identified elements strongly suggesting that the earliest Christian communities operated on organizational principles vastly different from those later established. Instead of rigid hierarchical structures, these communities appear to have functioned as dynamic networks of teachers and students, where authority stemmed from demonstrated wisdom and the proven capacity to facilitate spiritual transformation in others. Mary Magdalene emerges in these texts as a pivotal figure within these networks, recognized not merely for her proximity to Jesus, but for her own formidable capabilities as a teacher and spiritual guide. The texts portray communities where men and women participated as equals in spiritual leadership roles, and where gender differences didn't dictate access to advanced teachings or community responsibilities. The preservation of these alternative traditions in Ethiopia has also brought to light highly sophisticated approaches to sacred text interpretation, approaches that recognized multiple layers of meaning and employed hermeneutical methods seamlessly integrating intellectual analysis with contemplative practice. These frameworks acknowledge that texts like the Gospels held dimensions of meaning accessible only through forms of understanding that transcended purely literal or historical analysis. The Ethiopian manuscripts contain commentaries and interpretations that showcase extraordinary levels of theological and spiritual sophistication, suggesting these traditions maintained access to forms of wisdom that were tragically lost in other currents of early Christianity. Studies of these texts have further identified compelling evidence that Ethiopian traditions preserved understandings of mystical experience and spiritual transformation that diverged significantly from those developed within institutional Christianity. These understandings recognize that figures like Jesus and Mary Magdalene had attained states of consciousness, enabling them to act as bridges between ordinary and transcendent dimensions of reality. The texts describe processes of spiritual development capable of facilitating similar experiences in others, suggesting that these capacities weren't exclusive to specific historical figures, but inherent potentials that could be cultivated through disciplined practice and proper guidance. The relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene emerges in these manuscripts as a paradigm of profound spiritual collaboration, one that clearly transcended the conventional categories used to describe ordinary human relationships. The texts suggest their connection represented a form of union that holistically integrated physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual dimensions, thereby creating a model for relationships capable of serving as vehicles for mutual transformation and advanced spiritual development. This deep understanding of spiritual relationship didn't negate the human and emotional aspects of their connection, but rather situated them within a broader context that recognized the inherent transformative possibilities in authentic connection. Beyond the conventional narratives, ancient Ethiopian manuscripts unveil a profound understanding of authentic intimacy. These texts also preserve teachings suggesting that figures like Jesus and Mary Magdalene worked in tandem, transmitting forms of wisdom that demanded both masculine and feminine energies for their full communication. This wasn't some abstract notion. It was a recognition that certain spiritual truths could only be truly grasped by integrating perspectives and capacities traditionally associated with those very principles. The insights gleaned from these manuscripts imply that separating or ranking these elements created artificial barriers, blocking access to a more complete spiritual comprehension. The traditions within these writings also lay out specific practices and rituals designed to facilitate direct experiences of consciousness, states that granted immediate understanding of truths, which might otherwise demand years of theoretical study. These weren't simplistic methods. They wove together meditation, contemplation, body work, and ceremonial ritual in ways that forged a fertile ground for deep transformation. The manuscripts strongly suggest that Jesus and Mary Magdalene had not only developed particularly effective versions of these practices, but that their collaborative work significantly amplified their transformative power. Researchers delving into these Ethiopian manuscripts have also noted references to teachings that champion sacred sexuality as a legitimate component of advanced spiritual development. And let's be clear, this wasn't some free-for-all or an excuse for indulgence. Rather, it was a profound acknowledgement that sexual energy, when properly understood and channeled, could serve as a potent fuel for spiritual transformation. The texts indicate that Jesus and Mary Magdalene possessed sophisticated insights into these facets of human experience, and that their guidance included practical instruction on integrating sexuality and spirituality for holistic personal growth. The sheer fact that these alternative understandings were preserved within Ethiopian traditions demonstrates that, during the early centuries of Christianity, there existed theological currents far more integrative and holistic regarding human nature and spiritual potential. These currents recognized that genuine transformation demanded the cultivation of all dimensions of human experience: physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. Denying or suppressing any of these, the texts argue, created imbalances that hindered full development. They describe pathways that honored the complete complexity of being human, while simultaneously facilitating a transcendence of ordinary limitations. Contemporary studies of these manuscripts have further revealed Ethiopian understandings of spiritual community that sharply diverged from the institutional models that would later dominate. These insights recognize that authentic communities formed around shared commitments to mutual transformation and spiritual development, rather than rigid adherence to specific creeds or unwavering loyalty to institutional authorities. The texts paint a picture of communities operating like living organisms, where each member contributed according to their unique capacities while receiving support for their own continuous growth. The implications of these discoveries for our understanding of iconic figures like Jesus and Mary Magdalene are nothing short of revolutionary. Instead of seeing them as distant historical figures whose meanings have been cemented by centuries of traditional interpretation, The Ethiopian manuscripts present them as living examples of human potentials that can be developed and actualized in any era. Their teachings emerge not as dogmas to be passively accepted, but as direct invitations to personal exploration and transformation, capable of leading to similar experiences of profound understanding and advanced spiritual capacity. This transformative perspective on the legacy of Jesus and Mary Magdalene suggests their true gift to humanity wasn't merely their specific teachings or historical examples. It was their powerful demonstration of inherent possibilities lying dormant within every human being. The Ethiopian texts suggest they developed and exemplified ways of living that seamlessly integrated love, wisdom, spiritual power, and compassionate service, creating timeless blueprints for complete human development. Their relationship, in this light, emerges as a potent demonstration of how authentic intimacy can serve as a catalyst for mutual transformation and the expanded expression of spiritual potentials. The manuscripts further reveal that Ethiopian traditions harbored understandings about the nature of continuous revelation. They recognize that authentic spiritual wisdom wasn't confined to specific historical teachings, but continued to emerge through individuals and communities who cultivated the necessary capacities to receive and transmit it. This insight implied that figures like Jesus and Mary Magdalene had set precedents and established channels for ongoing forms of revelation that could manifest through anyone sufficiently developed and prepared. The preservation of these alternative traditions in Ethiopia represents an extraordinary boon for our contemporary grasp of early Christianity and its transformative possibilities. These texts offer windows into forms of spirituality that integrate mystical, practical, communal, and individual dimensions, creating fertile ground for complete human development. Their core message is a compelling invitation to discover and actualize similar potentials within ourselves and our communities.